think even if we're only going to scratch the surface, we can make that a really scratch a satisfying itch, and also make it as convivial as possible. So please do feel unafraid to ask questions in the chat, and for us to make this as discursive and as friendly as possible. My aim is for everyone to share insights into their distinctive practices, and for us to all leave this session with no other choice than to find out more and to see more of each of your works and practices, and to get to know it better in real life. So with that, our colleagues at Stephen Friedman Gallery are able to share some images that allow for a kind of virtual walkthrough of the exhibition. And that might be a helpful place for us to begin, because it allows us to understand how, as a group exhibition, it's been conceived as a series of effectively singular statements. And I think the place for us to begin, here we have works by Huguette Caland from the Rocinante series. And so I'd certainly like Brigitte to elaborate on how these works coexist between the caftans that can be worn, the works on paper, and then the way these beautiful gestural articulations of line on the page take on this wonderfully choreographic energy within the space as these three-dimensional wire paper sculptures. So Brigitte, perhaps we should start there and start with you.
May I start with the dresses, because chronologically they make sense. So chronologically, the dresses are made first, and the dresses, both of them, are almost the first dress. It's not called the first dress, the one with the patches. So these are Palestinian patches, and the dress is called Enhash. And Enhash is the organization that Mom created in Beirut with a few friends of hers in the late 60s. And it was to allow, it still exists, to allow Palestinian women in the camps to be able to support their families. So these are small patchworks. I think we have 13 or 14 on them, 2 on each sleeves, the same number of patchwork in front and in the back. What is amazing in this piece is that women had a tradition of embroidery, and it still represents very much, it's a Palestinian symbol, this sort of embroidery. And when they started, the work was quite rough, not as sophisticated as it is today. And when you compare the work on this to the work the women today do in Hajj, it's amazing. So another thing that is important in this dress is that the small stitches that were made are made by craftswomen. And Mom, in her last painting, like if you go to the Rocinante, to the orange Rocinante, there are some of the points are like stitches. They maybe not as clearly on this painting, but on many of her late paintings. And the edge, so here it's a combination of points that remind stitching on canvas, and the borders are also an evocation of tapestries, of carpets. So here we're also in another form of textile, and these are the influences that Mom grew up with. Carpets, like many households in the Middle East have carpets, and the embroidery also. So this is crochet, and this is the last dress. So here you have almost the first dress and the last dress. And the last dress is mischievous as Mom was. It's there and it's it covers and it doesn't cover at the same time.
Yeah, it's concealing and it's revealing. What I find fascinating too is that as garments, they were designed to be worn, but then equally to be displayed. And am I correct that they're displayed on these wooden mannequins that were also made by your mother?
Yes, and they were made, each mannequin is made for a specific dress. So yes, they're part of the piece, the art.
I think that is something that will end up recurring throughout the conversation, is this way in which the body takes up space, but the relationship between fabric or various garments and the body, and the way that we move around it, the way that it takes up physical space. And so to think that something could be made with this dual intention of existing as if it were a sculpture within physical space, but also to have this other life.
Mom never separated between things. There was a sort of fluidity between, you were mentioning crafts and art and the difference. Mom didn't see any difference with any media. As long as she could continue working, she would do it. I mean, she did objects in papier-mâché. We consider them art because they have her touch, her writing, her painting on them. So she had no limits on many levels. When it comes to the Rocinante, so here, yes, you have threads, you have different medias. Again, the title Rocinante is the horse of Don Quixote, of Cervantes' novel. Mom just drew first the sketches that are shown also in the exhibition, and made them. So they used to hold like this everywhere in the house, and then they're really fragile, as you can see. It's the first time I see all of them put together in an ensemble. Usually we had one or two, and last time they were shown, they were hanging. They were not put on the ground, and I find that really beautiful. But here also symbolically, Rocinante is an aging horse, and Mom did several bodies of work that she called Rocinante. And when I asked her why Rocinante, we were in Turkey, and she said, because I'm aging like Rocinante, my feet, my knees hurt. And it's amazing that she uses thread as if she was mending things, putting things together, turning around something as if she was keeping it together. So symbolically, I find it quite interesting.
It's incredibly moving to think about the frailty of the human body, but then it becomes simultaneously a celebration, because they're incredibly joyous, and there's such a sense of movement and fluidity.
And lightness at the same time. I mean, some of them are with paper and thread, but the paper, if you touch it, your finger goes almost through it. You were talking earlier, you were quoting someone saying that it was like praying. And what's amazing is that the stitches Mom used to do, well, they were not stitches. They were, she would paint, but she would do cross stitching on her latest paintings. And that was therapeutic. And it also, it was dissociating her mind with her hands and letting something go through. So it would be a little bit like leaving the unconscious expressing what it wanted. So.
Thank you very much for that, Brigitte. I wonder if we might move into the next room of the exhibition via the images that we have. We can bring in the rest of our panel. So Jeffrey, here we are looking at the way in which your works interrelate one to another. And I will, for the purposes of refreshing everyone's mind to a quote that I'd made earlier in our kind of pre-chat, I was in thinking about the feelings that this exhibition left so strongly with me, which was really a sense of something spiritual or, you know, almost transcendental. I went back to a quote by the writer Louise Erdrich, and in Four Souls, she has this quote that begins, "To sow is to pray," but it goes on to make, within a very specific context, I will say, so I'm taking it out of that context, to make a very gendered assertion about the role of sewing within a particular community of women. And she goes on to say, "Men don't understand this. They see the whole, but they don't see the stitches. They don't see the speech of the creator in the work of the needle. We mend. We women turn things inside out and set things right. We salvage what we can of human garments and piece the rest into blankets. Sometimes our stitchers stutter and slow. Only a woman's eyes can tell. Other times the tension in the stitches might be too tight because of tears, but only we know what emotion went into the making. Only women can hear the prayer." And what I think is so powerful about an exhibition like Threadbare is we know that sewing and working with textiles is not the sole preserve of women by any means, but to have both your work and Jonathan's in the exhibition brings to bear a whole host of things that I think is very important, particularly within the contemporary art scene, to help unravel and dismantle some of those assumptions about who makes and what materials we're drawn to. And so I would really love to hear from you what first drew you to stitching and beadwork as a form of your artistic expression.
Well, I mean, it's probably been in my life since I was a child. And then, you know, both of my grandmothers were both, I think, would have identified as having made crafts. My grandmother, Lily Gibson, on my father's side, she, it was pretty wild. When she passed away, we looked through her closet and she had found a pattern that worked for her. And she made that same dress in, I don't know how many different fabrics for about probably 30 years of her life. And, you know, it was a very, the pattern was probably a shift dress that she kind of came across, I'm going to guess, in the late 60s or early 70s, based on the style. And, you know, she would wear her hair, she had very long hair that she would put into a bun with a beaded barrette. And she was seen as an elder of her community. You know, I think, I don't know, I remember there was a group of women who she was friends with, and they spent a lot of time together, who were seen as the traditional elders of their community. And I guess based on the way she dressed, I would have seen her as the modern one, because the other ones wore apron dresses that are considered more traditional. She also made jewelry, she made quilts, and she was an incredible homemaker. My grandfather was a minister, and so she really saw her domestic abilities as gifts from God. And then on my mother's side, very similar. My grandfather on my mother's side was also a minister, and her mother also did quilting, made clothes, and would repurpose anything she could get her hands on, she would repurpose. So I think in that sense, we had basket weavers in the family. And so I just grew up with the weavings, the textiles, the baskets. And going to school and studying art and being taught a distinction between craft and fine art, I think I went through a period of rejecting, my love of pattern and textiles and craft, and then came back to it probably, let me see, about a little over around 15 years ago. I mean, I would kind of dip in and out of it, but even when I was solely doing paintings and they were totally abstract and process oriented, I was thinking about mark making as the way that a warp and a weft would work, or the way that like a hole in a textile would work. So it was always there. But when I came, I just decided it had to do with communication with an audience, that I decided to go directly to what I was referencing. So if I'm referencing beads, just use beads. If I'm referencing stitching, just use stitching. If I'm referencing textiles, just use those. And that's also what led me to working with found or sourced materials that have their own kind of narratives. So I think, it's a very healing process, I think, making things. And it's something that I've returned to numerous times, and I think have kind of bonded with other people about, the sensibility, the mind of someone who enjoys this repetitive process of making in the way that stitching, is. That, I always tell everybody, it's like, to make a stitch or to put on one bead is not complicated. You can teach somebody that, but then in a work, you repeat it 1,000 times, or it's 1,000 beads, and it's this kind of cumulative process where the complexities start coming in. But yeah, I would say as a sensibility, it's just always been with me. And I still continue to collect quilts. We're showing a quilt also. I'm showing a quilt at the gallery. And as far as the gender, it's interesting. I kind of came of age in the 90s, when I think at least what I learned with race and gender was a rejection of kind of any sort of essentialist identity. But I do think, I revere women. And I think part of that rejection of craft had to do with, coming to terms with my own kind of sexuality, and also how I wanted to present to the world. But then at some point it became kind of a relief to kind of defer to histories that were recognized as being gendered towards women. But then also, really believing in a kind of matriarchal kind of history of many indigenous tribes. And I do think there's a sensibility. There's definitely, being a parent and having a daughter and a son, it's things that I think about often. There's definitely, it's in the air of the culture that we treat males and females differently. And I think there's a conscious effort on my part, I know, to kind of counter those things and to kind of mix them up and kind of ride this line of whether it's, is it essentialism, or is it choice, or is it cultural, or is it, nature? And so those things continue to be in the work for me.
And I think also kind of powerfully and multi-layered in the explorations and elaborations thereof. I love you just saying like riding the line, because I was thinking so much about that in how you communicate through text in your work. You see that in an example such as this: speak to me so that I can understand. But I'm also very interested in the ways in which some of your choice of lettering can start to elide in easy legibility. So with a work like My Heart Beats for the One I Love, it takes some time to be there with it so that the letters can kind of reveal themselves, and the way that they kind of come to the fore and then retreat is incredibly beautiful. And I was thinking about the framing of this work, even as you were speaking about the bead and the singular, or what that means as the repetitive act to make this cumulative statement. And the whole is incredibly beautiful and powerful to stand in front of. Like I really want to emphasize that, but I'm also very interested in this strategy of how seductive it is to be yeah, well, materially and palette wise to be kind of lured in, but then to also have to we as the viewer also have to give some time. You know, it's not the kind of the easy reveal to understand the message in the fullness of the thing. And so is that something that you've also considered very fully in terms of how you would use text or obscure it for an audience member?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of the materials, I hate referring to the 90s, but it is really when I kind of started a lot of these questions and trying to figure out answers. You know, also during my education, that period of time was to really distrust beauty and what was considered the beautiful, you know, that it always had an underlying agenda, which was to somehow co-opt our support. And, you know, when I was looking at nature on one hand, and also just indigenous material culture, you know, the beauty that exists there is very layered for me. And I almost want to think that there's a kind of indigenous concept around beauty that has yet to be articulated. But it is there to lure you in, and it is there to please you. And in many ways, the beauty keeps you there. And when you're ready to access the next layer, you know, of what's there, then I think it's there for you. And I think with the words, you know, I collect words constantly, but the thing about the words is that they have to be open-ended enough that anyone can bring their personal narrative to it and feel that this set of words is about them. So my heart beats for the one I love. You know, it was interesting. People have responded to people who have lost people during this past year, or to the idea of relationships being important during this past year. I know that for me, you know, obviously love has taken on a different kind of meaning with like a family, like my own children. And so in the same way that, you know, I remember also like kind of songs in the 80s, like pop songs in the 80s. And I would think that I'd be watching a band and I'd be like, I know they have to be gay. Like, I don't know why no one will just admit that this. And I was always looking for that. And I was looking for at the pronoun usage in the love songs, you know, which ones can speak to me being in love or you know, thinking about boys as opposed to girls. And so I think it kind of, you know, I play around a lot with like pronouns and ways that kind of give space for someone to maintain their privacy or maintain their own space. And then also kind of, you know, there was another painting that last year was shown, and the text was "To say I love you right out loud," from Joni Mitchell. And, you know, that was another one. It was like that kind of joy, but it comes from a place of having to make the decision to reveal. So, and then the text, you know, I don't want the painting to serve as merely a background for the text. And so thinking from a painterly perspective in terms of figure-ground relationships, you know, I developed these letter forms so that they could fit into the kind of geometry of what happens in the paintings. And then that's a whole nother kind of explanation about where I come to geometry. But and then the beadwork, again, I'm going to go back to beauty and this kind of vibrational pattern and my use of color. This piece here, Power, the Power board, I've used the word power a number of times, and the Power board is actually over a skinning board, which is probably from, I think we estimated it to be from about the 1830s. And so this is a board that's underneath here that would have been used for not only ironing clothes, but it also would have been used for skinning animals. And so this is where you would prepare meats and things. And, you know, I was looking for different kinds of supports other than traditional canvases. And the original ones were stretched with elk hide and then painted. And then once the beadwork in the studio became just this kind of, I guess strategy is not a bad word, it just seemed so decadent to cover this tall board, which is very heavy, but you know, this is what was it, a little over 6 feet tall. And the other thing I love about craft is, you know, in our world of mass produced and commercial, it's so completely impractical. You know, I love that there's something counter to the care that you put into making something like this and the amount of time. It really falls out of sync in many ways with the way that, you know, contemporary life is navigated.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think it helps us understand so much about not only a painstaking process, but one that is so much has been put into it, but you're also giving so much back to, you know, those of us who are then effectively communing with the work, spending time with the work in physical space. And I think that happens formally and aesthetically on so many different levels. You know, certainly for the one work that we haven't really spoken much about, I so much wanted to hear the bells ringing.
Yeah.
You know, I really, and I'm always respectful. I don't touch anything. But, you know, I really wanted to hear it. And I felt that there's always this suggestion of something, and the fact that, you know, the existence of the work is the purpose, is its own purpose. So, you know, to your point about something mass produced that has, say, a particular function, or a function that, you know, very soon will be designed to become obsolete so that we need to replace it, that there's something so emphatic across this exhibition and across each of the works within it that really speaks to, I think, a very embodied presence and a very kind of unapologetic statement of not only occupying space, but inviting us to occupy space along with the objects. This might be a good moment for us to move on to Tao's installation and to look at the works that are installed there. These two that are floor-based and the two that are wall-based. So Tao, it's really, to spend time with these is, yeah, I'm almost lost for words. I think there's something about encountering these kind of anthropomorphic forms and wanting to know more about them and how they came into existence. And I'm quoting you back to yourself now, but you've referred to your work as celestial bodies. And I'm wondering if as a starting point for us to think about the monochrome, your relationship to materials in particular that's so rich and rewarding. But if we start there with the kind of the nature of the celestial body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my artwork is sort of my spirituality. Like everything I make is an altar of sorts. And I also consider these to be portals. So as I'm working, I'm thinking a lot about repatriation and the loopholes that I'm trying to sort of uncover. I spend a lot of time longing and lusting after objects that exist in museums, and feeling a lot of, I think, remorse and pain for the way that those things exist, and wondering about their origins, curiosity to the point that it can sometimes sadden me. So I think that I'm a conduit, and I want to believe that artwork is just, you know, different stories and allegories and messages that are coming back towards me, that already exist, that I can then sort of use my hands to, you know, manifest physically. So for me, I think a lot about ancestors, spirits, ghosts, and also angels, and how all of those things are kind of mutable, and also very much interchangeable in my work. I don't see them as being separate from one another. So when I make these, I'm trying to communicate with another place. And I, as an artist, exist in the imaginary. So I have a very kind of tight and insular relationship to the studio. And I try and draw from these places that exist in my head, but I believe are also very fluid and very present with other artists, especially artists in the diaspora. And I think that, I don't know, I believe in pictorial memory and Black pictorial memory being really strong. And I think that there's sort of a morphic resonance that carries through over to different communities of makers and craftspeople. I don't know that there's any, direct lineage within my family history that has to do specifically with textiles or fabric, although I'm sure that there is. I'm not, familiar with it. But I do see myself in conversation with so many other makers who came before me, who I've sometimes not been aware of, as I've been growing my practice. And I'm always kind of just dumbfounded by the fact that we really find ourselves in the imaginary. I think that's where we kind of connect. So this particular body of work, the wall work specifically, I would consider them to be sort of talismans. I started the series basically right at the beginning of the pandemic. Not all of my work is this structured. A lot of the quilts that I make, and I don't know that I should even call them quilts, but a lot of the wall-based fabric works that I create are a lot more abstract. But this particular work came from a place of me needing to exercise control and create a sense of unity. There's a lot of symmetry in these works. And they're much more sort of precise and a little bit more graphic than some of my other work. But these were meant to sort of be, I guess, power talismans for people that were bringing new life into the world, for a lot of my friends who were getting ready to welcome children into their life. And it just came from a place of me feeling like a bit of heartbreak for the state of the world, but also just incredibly inspired by, I guess, the power and the resilience in, continuing. The fact that people continue, life goes on, there still is love, there still is sex, there still is all of this power. These quilts use Ndikra symbols, which are native to West Africa, and they're quite ancient. You can find them on government buildings. They're very prominent in textiles. You can see them here in Brooklyn, all over the place. They're woven into the culture, and they each have a very sort of poetic, also sometimes very like pinpointed meaning and literal definition. Like the leg of the hen, for example, this is meant to like manifest, courage. And it's a symbol of courage. And it's also a very kind of, I don't know, it's a sharp sort of image. And it reminds me of, the talons of an eagle or something like that. The snake symbolizes rebirth, regeneration. This work was really just, me kind of trying to, I guess, navigate the changes that are happening in life, personally and also globally, and how to kind of, manifest strength and put that out into the world.
When you speak about strength and resilience, that actually brings me back to some of your material choices, because how do you find, it seems to me that you're starting with an incredibly resilient material, and then often a material that's lived some other life in another form that then gets effectively reincarnated, re-embodied through your hands and through your kind of world building. So are you able to share with us how you source your materials?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many different methods. When I can, like to work off of donations. So I'll often, tell people where I am. Normally, when we're not in a global pandemic, I travel quite a bit. It's monumental to what I do, actually, because as part of my self-teaching, I like to sort of challenge myself by going to different landscapes and trying to work with whatever I can find there. And I learn as I work that fabric is such a strong signifier of a culture or a place. It varies so much. And, it was difficult at the beginning of lockdown because I was no longer able to have this sort of intimacy where I would, collect other people's things, essentially. I'm lucky because I have archives of different fabrics and clothing, household objects that, you know, some of them I've had for years, but I like for there to be a sort of through line, and everything I make, there's a piece of the last sculpture. There's, you know, a common thread, no pun intended. But, you know, that way the work kind of, there's a material DNA that's kind of stretched out through my entire body of work. I love leather because, you know, it's skin. It comes from a living thing. It is resilient, but it's also very tender. And there's something that happens when you work it by hand, which is that, you know, it really does show itself to you, and it loves you back, and it reveals these beautiful curves and textures. It's porous and oily, and it's, you know, it's a living thing. And I just think it's the most romantic material. And I work with so many different objects, and I have many different, you know, methods of construction. But for the past couple of years, it's something that I just can't pull myself away from, because it is so, I guess, satisfying, and it is healing. It is a therapy. I love to sew, and there's a sort of, I don't know, there's a bond that happens when you are spending so much time with the material in your hands. And, you know, for a lot of my larger works, especially the wall-based ones, I'm assembling them on the floor, so I'm on top of them, and the fabric is often draped over my lap. There's a very intimate sort of bond that happens. And at a certain point, you know, you feel it come alive. And I'm sure Jeffrey can relate, but there's a point, you know, with each object where you just feel it, and you feel that it's alive. And it's very visceral when these things leave my studio, because I do feel they're gone. Like, I feel their goneness. I feel like they're no longer there, and I long for them. Mm-hmm. So I feel that everything I make is alive. I feel that, you know, they're very spiritual objects. They are sometimes ghostly, and I do think they are sometimes haunted. And I don't think haunting is a scary thing. I think the notion of, you know, ghosts and haunting being negative is something that's actually very much rooted in colonial ideals, and can be specifically anti-Black and anti-Indigenous.
Yeah, and quashing other forms of faith and belief, and the coexistence of, yeah, those of us in physical bodies, and, you know,
absolutely,
spirits that are outside of physical bodies.
Yeah, and spirits that hold you, and spirits that have, you know, held me up for my whole life, and that I communicate with. So that's where I'm at right now, and that's where these specific works are coming from.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm really pleased to have that we've alighted on this image, because I spent a lot of time on both figures' ears, mm-hmm. and the intricacy of the ears and the earlobes. This wasn't a question that I had written down, but I'm very interested in, how long does it take for you to make a work like this?
It really depends. If you want to get like a little meta about it, like years, because some of these fabrics I've held on to for that long. Mm-hmm. So if you want to start really from the origin of an object, you know, I could hold a piece of clothing or a shell. I use seashells in every single artwork for years.
It has seashells around his neck, doesn't?
Yeah, that's actually bone.
Okay.
Those are bone beads. But, you know, is the action of constructing the object, you know, is that the determining factor of how long it takes to make? Because, you know, essentially I've held on to these parts for quite a long time. And I also like to think that things are never done. So, you know, I feel like my body of work is sort of a sci-fi kind of chronicle that's always unfolding, that's never going to be finished. And I like to think that these works are all one, and they're all, you know, part of the same story. But if you want to talk about the physical construction, everything is hand sewn. I don't use any machines in the studio. I do work with assistants, but this is very labor intense, very drawn out, time consuming work.
I think you've already answered it. Yeah, it wasn't to quantify. I think that you've given a beautiful answer. I'd read somewhere you speaking about how objects speak to you. And so I was very much thinking when looking at the component parts that make up the work, thinking about how the kind of suede texture on the kind of buttocks or the hip bones where the pelvis is opening on some of the wall pieces relative to some of the other, that there also seemed to be such a really vibrant and loud conversation between the individual elements and how they all come together to kind of to make the work. And so I think to think about a work being birthed because you selected it and held on to the textile until the time is right, I think tells us everything we need to know about the labor intensive nature of the process.
Thank you.
Are you able to point out where some of the seashells are for those of us, or for individuals who are seeing the JPEG but haven't yet been able to see the work in the field?
So the eyeballs of my sculptures are either stones or shells. In my studio, I have several different bins that I keep different archives of different objects, and I like to separate them by location so I can remember where each one was found. And then the eyes of this are 2 different shells, and then there are also cookies or sand dollars, which are very small and fragile. And then around the neck are bone beads, ox bone. I think I have a really strong attachment to specifically shells and stones because they are so mineral, because they are things that have often spent time so close to the ground or washing around in the sand for so many years. And they do like literally become charged by those elements. So they carry a lot of life with them. They're also very friendly materials. They're very giving, and they have smells, and they smell like the ocean. And I think also, you know, going back to this thing about pictorial memory, I believe that part of my affinity for those specific things comes from the fact that I'm a Caribbean person. And in my lineage, those are things that, you know, my ancestors would have also held on to and would have also seen every day and stepped on and had close to their bodies. And I like to adorn my artworks, and I like to think of these things as offerings. I consider them, you know, as being these objects that will be vulnerable in an art space and such a different environment from my studio. And I want to honor them, and I want to offer them protection and love and beauty. So this is me kind of giving them those offerings. I love the details, like working on an ear or a nose, or the shading of the lips, or the coloring of the eyes, making earrings, making jewelry for them. That's my favorite part.
Thank you for that. We've got a question that's come in from the audience, and it is for you, Tao. And the question is, what do you use to fill your work?
It depends on the outer fabric. But a lot of the time I'll use recycled polyfibers, which is essentially broken down recycled plastic. It's quite hefty, and it can be lofty or it can be hard. Sometimes I use foam, and sometimes I use fabric. Because of what I do, I amass like a huge amount of scraps in the studio, and I don't like to waste things. So I'll often use that to put back into the sculptures to solidify them. I have used cotton before, quilt batting. It really just depends on, you know, there's a lot of like very practical kind of structural elements to it. But I like to reuse where I can. So yeah.
Thank you. Another question has come in also for you, Tao. Can you say a little more about what you mean by pictorial memory? Is it connected with epigenetics and ancestral memory?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. The way that I would maybe describe it is having having a certain lust for certain colors, having a relationship to certain imagery, having an understanding of, I guess, certain symbolism even, and that being a part of your lineage and your DNA that you share with other peoples in the diaspora. That's how I would describe it. I believe in morphic resonance, which is a theory of evolution that describes things happening in symbiosis across different geographies and territories. So, for example, before I ever started, really understanding about Gee's Bend or the quilt makers from Gee's Bend, I was in dialogue with that visual language. And I believe that this is part of that resonance. And this is part of the way that, our methods of making towards wandering, reusing, attraction for certain colors, patterns, materials is very much shared, even though I would have never gone there or seen those works or even known at the point when I started making them. I think is something that I believe in and that is really fascinating to me, is this unification. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that was a great answer. Thank you. I really appreciate, there's so many, I was gonna say threads and then I'm trying to stop so that I'm not being punny, but I can't help myself. But between each of you talking about making as a therapeutic act. And I think that there's something incredibly healing in that, and about the ways in which these works make space for a certain kind of acceptance on a number of different levels, whether that's acceptance of the self, whether that's acceptance and a sense of belonging to a specific community, but then also this kind of larger sense of universal belonging, and the fact that each of the, I would say, rooms within the exhibition are able to volley between the profoundly personal and the universal is, it's worth saying, because it's not obvious to think that work is capable of that, or that work can do that and then hold the space so equally and so evenly. Some more questions have come in, and I think we have time to ask them. So for Jeffrey and Tao, it sounds as if the physical act of making is vital for you. Do you ever work with studio assistants? So I will leave you to answer, but I know, Tao, you'd already hinted at that.
Mm-hmm.
I work with a team of people here in the studio, and we're in this iteration of the studio since about 2012. So we're coming up on 10 years. And some people have been working with me since 2012, in fact. And then, the most recent person would be sort of about 2 years ago. And it's important to me that we do everything kind of what I refer to as like in-house, because I think the kind of shared sensibility and being able to like physically check in with things and like make sure that it's all coming through the same lens is really important for the work. I
read an interview, Jeffrey, about your move upstate and the way that you've built this community made me just want to come and work for you and be one of your assistants. But it sounds like a very beautiful way of establishing a flow between your ability to then conceptualize ideas, but to work with individuals who are very much, of a piece and in tune with how these works can then be realized and then exist in the world. Yeah.
It serves a few purposes, but I know I was a studio assistant when I was in undergrad, among other jobs. And, trying to figure out the art world is, it's like walking in the dark for the better part of most of our lives. And I try to offer the people who work here, who are all artists in their own practices, you know, to share with them. I'm like, you know, my choices are not for everybody, but I'm happy to share with them if it makes things easier for them to figure out a path for themselves. And yeah, it's been really interesting to have what feels like multiple hands, multiple sets of hands. Sometimes there's time for just pure experimentation and to see what happens if we add another bead on a fringe, or if we do it a little bit tighter, you know, these little like sample things. And I think I've kind of always, to be quite honest, like thought about my studio practice akin to sort of an atelier, sort of a couture atelier, in terms of, you know, trying to, you know, one of my early interests was the parallel histories of handcraft, you know, different kind of cultures and the kind of value that exists, or the kind of, you know, lack of value that exists in different cultural handcrafts. And so for a lot of the material objects that I look at, you know, they've been referred to as kitsch and camp and, you know, tourist novelty. And to me, that's what makes them really valuable and kind of overlooked. They've been kind of dismissed into these, you know, even the word craft sometimes is a compliment and sometimes is sort of like a, you know, putting it into a little corralled section. So yeah, but the studio is a very special place to me. And during the year in particular has been a haven of what feels like safety.
Jeffrey, are you still with us?
I am, yeah.
Okay, the sound cut out just for a moment.
Did I get really still?
There's another question for you. And this is, can you expand on the indigenous concept around beauty? This is something that you mentioned when we were in your room, and how it is yet to be thoroughly investigated. Is this a key driver for you in your work?
Wow, that's a really deep question. But I think it is a key driver for my work. And I have a number of friends and who are art historians, who are indigenous art historians, who are curators and thinkers. And I posed this question to them, and, you know, the gaps in the indigenous creative histories, like, let's say if we're looking at the last like 300 years, there's so many huge gaps where things were not kind of written down or articulated relative to, let's say, like an art history canon, you know? And so, and one of the things I've learned over the past 20 years is really, there are many things which are not to be shared. Like, there's a reason to leave things unarticulated, especially when you're referencing spiritual practices, you know? And so a number of years ago, I really had to clarify for myself in talking about my work. I identify as an artist, and there is a difference between what I do versus, let's say, somebody who makes work for cultural practice, for specific cultural practice or continuity. If anyone from within any of these communities ever wanted to use something that I've made or acknowledge it within a cultural practice, I'm happy to do that. But I feel like it would have to be initiated from within that community. You know, dealing with anything that has to do with spirituality or what would be considered ceremonial, I feel like really requires a community, you know? And so for me, I really am, art gives me a lot of allowances, you know, in terms of like being able to question things, being able to author things, being able to mix things. And in that sense, I feel like it shifts the subject for me. And the beauty one, you know, I think, I mean, philosophically, every indigenous nation has, you know, is very specific unto itself. And so I think the kind of philosophy of our relationship to the land or to the universe, of one of being maybe in balance, maybe, and I'm just thinking out loud at this point, but maybe reflects beauty, if that makes sense. You know, if there's a kind of restraint, you know, and I have to say, as much as my work has so many layers in it of material and ideas and histories, there is a tremendous amount of restraint to get this many things to work together as one, you know. It's not a free-for-all. A lot of the process is like mixing with some degree of autonomy, but then there's always the point about just like, but what does it add up to? Like, has it added up to something that's more than the sum of its parts? Like, have I actually delivered something that is a thing, you know? So I don't know. I mean, I love talking to, in particular, like Indigenous thinkers, and I would love to pursue this idea of an Indigenous concept of beauty. But, and I don't want to talk too long. I will say one last thing. I mentioned nature before, and there was a couple of books that came out about how many things have survived hundreds of years because we desire them. Like, their beauty is what enables their survival. The same thing with foods. It's their flavor that enables their survival. So anything that can capture our desire, we will protect, you know, and we will make sure that it continues to exist. And so there's something within that, I know, that's always really intrigued me.
Well, thank you for that. I think we only have time for one more question, and this one's come in for Brigitte. Can you please expand on the impact of location on Huguette Caland's work, specifically her moves between Beirut and Paris and Los Angeles?
She carried, like almost everyone, traces of the cities where she lived in. I think about the relationship to fabric. She did the collection with after working on these dresses, which were considered art dresses. She went from this to creating a line with Pierre Cardin, which is in a way a continuity of this. But then all her life she made her own dresses. She didn't make them, she didn't sew them, but she designed them and she had them made by someone. And then again, the stitching, the way she finished the details of certain paintings that are like stitches or cross stitching, this is the way she called them, is a reminiscence of her childhood and of Palestinian embroidery and of In'ash. And so yes, everything it just came out in different ways. But she kept things from each period of her life, each city where she lived until the end. One of her last exhibitions in Beirut was Mejan Zanne, which is my young years. And she painted everything in Los Angeles, even if the show was in Beirut. So, did I answer the question? Is it?
Well, I believe you have. This is our hour finished. So I thank you very, very much for your time and your generosity. You've given so much. There wasn't much in my way of questioning other than really like effusive praise and to congratulate each of you on the exhibition. But thank you for finding ways to elaborate and articulate so many insights into your respective practices, and Brigitte, into your mother's practice, and a very layered presentation that I didn't even realize in so many ways was able to kind of capture a snapshot of such a long range of work, from that one of the first kaftans to one of the last. So I thank each of you very, very much.
Thank you.